Good afternoon. Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to the International Development Research Center, or IDRC. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue au CRDI. Mon nom est Joanne Charette. Je suis la vice-présidente de Stratégie générale et communication. It is my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon on behalf of IDRC's President, Jean Lebel. For your information, the event will be in English and is also being video recorded. During the question period, you are very welcome to ask your questions in both official languages. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Richard Samans. Mr. Samans is a member of the World Economic Forum's Managing Board. He previously served as Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute and was a Special Assistant for International Economic Policy to President Bill Clinton. Mr. Samans was also Senior Director for International Economic Affairs of the National Security Council. He will share with us key insights from the World Economic Forum Inclusive Growth and Development Report that was published earlier this year. Ce rapport constitue une grande avancée pour la mise en place d'un cadre permettant d'orienter les efforts de la communauté internationale en matière de croissance inclusive. Il présente notamment un nouvel indice mondial servant à évaluer à quel point les éléments structurels et institutionnels des pays favorisent la croissance inclusive. Le CRDI est très heureux d'animer l'événement de cet après-midi. La croissance inclusive est indissociable des efforts que nous déployons pour appuyer le savoir, l'innovation et les solutions dans le but d'améliorer les conditions de vie dans les pays en développement. Following Mr. Samans' presentation, we will have a panel discussion with Mr. Samans and Ms. Carolina Trivelli. Ms. Trivelli is CEO of Pagos Digital's Peruanos, a company focused on building financial inclusion in Peru. Ms. Trivelli previously served as Peru's Minister of Development and Social Inclusion and was also the Director General of the Institute of Peruvian Studies, among other roles. IDRC supported Ms. Trivelli's research into factors that entrench poverty and inequality in rural Latin America, as well as research into the impact of conditional cash transfers and asset building for the rural poor. Arjan de Haan, our own chef de programme du programme Emploi et Croissance du CRDI, animera la discussion de groupe. Il y aura également une période de questions à la fin de la session. So now, with my great pleasure, I'd like to ask Mr. Samans to come up.
Merci beaucoup. C'est un grand plaisir, un tel honneur d'être là aujourd'hui et d'avoir cette très bonne coopération avec le CRDI. I'm very happy that we've got a robust program of cooperation, and today is just a special opportunity to come here to have some interaction with the wealth of experience that you've gathered here. We had a wonderful meeting this morning with a range of governmental and non-governmental experts. What I thought we would do, just to open the discussion today, is to go briefly through a presentation that provides some of the main elements of the nature and findings of our Inclusive Growth and Development 2017 report. The World Economic Forum, for those of you who do not know us well, we are an international organization for public-private or multi-stakeholder cooperation. And cooperation means dialogue, it means research, it means action, partnership on the ground, a variety of things. But basically what we are is a platform for various stakeholders to come together and do some common work on common priorities. There is no priority that we've seen a greater resounding degree of agreement on than the need for a more socially inclusive economic growth model around the world, which was really the reason why we began thinking about this and utilizing our research and our convening capabilities to see whether we could help take a debate, which is a very robust and hot debate, around which there's a lot of agreement about the direction, the goal, but around which there is relatively little by way of common understanding of how you act on that aspiration. And so what we have before you today is a body of work that suggests both a framework or a mental map for how one might be able to achieve better integration of both the desire for a more rapid pace of economic growth, but all at the same time achieve as well an equitable distribution of participation in both the process of growth, employment and the like on the one hand, and the benefits of growth, income, quality of life, economic security on the other. That's how we think about inclusive growth. It's not an inequality agenda per se. It's not just about a social agenda, as important as those things are. It's about finding a framework within which, as part of the growth process, not as an afterthought, one engineers a more robust economy, but also an economy that has a much broader, more resilient, and socially inclusive base in terms of employment and in terms of these other aspects of the benefits of growth. Let's go to the first slide. I don't know who's... So just as a couple, I'm going to run you through a few quick things. You're well aware that inequality is a top-of-mind issue for societies and governments around the world. The direction of travel is not particularly encouraging in many regions of the world. The redder and yellower shaded countries are those where it's deteriorated. The green or blue ones are those in which it's been the progress has been better. Next slide, please. For G20 economies, we've given you a breakout by region, and you can see that across the G20 it remains a relatively high. Latin America has made some progress, however. Let's keep going. The evidence shows that, in fact, there is a growth tax, if you will, or penalty from excessive levels of inequality. And this is not just us speaking, it's the OECD who's done some research in this area. And to try to simplify that chart gives you a sense of if there hadn't been that high degree of inequality, what the overall growth level would have been. And in some countries, it would have been appreciably higher, for example, the UK, or my own, or I guess you got New Zealand there, for example. Next slide. There is a correlation, is what this graph shows, between high inequality on the one hand and low social mobility, that is to say, the ability of a younger person to attain a level of income that's equal to or better than his or her parents. It's important to think about this not just as, again, carving up an existing pie, but about growing the pie and also making the distribution of that pie more equitable. When you do both of them, then you really get a virtuous circle socially. And so we're looking at this as the intersection between the two, social inclusion and economic growth. Where are the win-wins in policy in this regard? Next slide. So we've done a couple of things in this body of work. One, that I'll talk about in a moment or two, is to think about what are those win-wins? What are the areas of institutional strength and policy where if you get them right, they can have a salutary effect on both the pace at which the pie is growing and the equity by which the pieces are apportioned throughout society. But secondly, and this is what's on the screen right now, we've thought about, well, if that's the concept, then how do we think about measuring performance? You as citizens, how do you think about grading your government in terms of its stewardship of the economy? Do you think about that in terms of whether it hits a high growth rate, the number that you see published every quarter? Or do you think about that in some other more human way? And from our standpoint, we believe that people evaluate the economic success of their country not based on the GDP per GDP statistic per quarter, or year for that matter, but rather by the extent to which the standard of living is progressing for as broad a segment of the population as can be. Now, having said that, think about the way we tend to grade economies. It's generally by GDP. So if you want to look up a list of economies by level of economic development, well, that's based on GDP, which is basically the size of the amount of production in the economy divided by the number of people. That's the conventional way we think about evaluating how big the economy is or whatnot. And how fast that pie is growing is basically the metric that governments sort of are evaluated on by the investment community, by the business community, by the society in general, because that's the metric that we have. What we are suggesting here is that that's just the top line. That's just one very important element. But the bottom line ultimate measure by which people evaluate the success of their country's economic performance is that living standards concept of both household income, household economic opportunity, security, economic security, and quality of life. And so we have put together an alternative measure to GDP for evaluating the level of economic development of countries. And we call it the Inclusive Development Index, and it is 12 different indicators grouped in 3 buckets: growth and development, inclusion, as well as intergenerational equity and sustainability. Sustainability both in the demographic sense as well as the environmental sense. And we feel that these key performance indicators of inclusive growth and development is a wider angled lens for evaluating the pace of economic progress in a country. Again, the Inclusive Development Index. It includes GDP because that's a critical element, but you can see for yourself on the screen that there are other elements here. And then we have taken these 12 KPIs, key performance indicators, and we've constructed a global index out of that. We haven't played, for those of you who care about these things, we've not weighted anything more than the other. And that's a choice that you can make if you want. If you go onto the website and you want to, for your country, you think some of this deserves more weight than others. But we feel that when you take a look at this calculation and then compare it as we do in our report to the traditional GDP per capita calculation, you get a clearer sense of those countries that have a more inclusive development or growth model than others. And this data gives you some sense of who the top 10 are by, on the one hand, the level of economic development, that's on the left side, and on the other hand, the trend of the last 5 years, if you will. You'll see Canada is very well generally on almost all aspects of our report. Canada does have a few weaknesses, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But one of its weaknesses was the trend for starting about 6 years ago. There's a 5-year window we were looking at. The progress was not very, very good. But this, I think, is reflected in the government's program here, where this has become a very important organizing logic for the government's economic strategy, and we feel that that is a very encouraging sign indeed. If you could back up for just one, I don't know whether you can read this, probably not too well, but this is a heat map of those 12 key performance indicators by a selection of G20 countries. And the green scores mean that for that particular indicator, the country does well vis-a-vis its peers, and red is the opposite. It's a traffic light type of shading. So in our report, we provide all this data, and we group advanced countries on the one hand and developing countries, and they can see sort of where their relative strengths and weaknesses are. Next slide. So that's what I just described as what we consider the output indicators. How do you measure success? So it's a new kind of performance indicator for economic progress. What's very important, however, for policymakers is figuring out, well, okay, perhaps I've identified some weaknesses, but what do I do about it? Where can I push? Where should I place a particular priority? And for that reason, we've constructed a framework which really drives the whole piece of work on 15 areas which potentially can provide a win-win outcome for growth and social inclusion in an economy. And so you see them up on the screen here. This is, I think, the heart of the work. We consider this ecosystem of 15 areas of structural policy, incentives, and institutional strength effectively the income distribution system underpinning modern market economies. Or more accurately stated, this is the mechanism by which living standards, the progress in living standards, are diffused widely in an economy. Now, you'll notice if you have 15 areas of policy, by definition, what that implies is there's no silver bullet. There's no magic wand here where you can just pick one thing. I know there's a lot of excitement about universal basic income and things like that. And I think actually there's a lot to commend some of those discussions. But all too often in the debate, it's sort of put out there as, okay, this is it. This is what we got to do. And no, in fact, there's a wider ecosystem of things that all influence both the pace of growth and the extent to which society participates in the process and benefits of that growth. And it's worth, in our view, taking all of these seriously, viewing them as an interactive ecosystem, what we call a potential virtuous circle of inclusive growth. Or conversely, if you leave this ecosystem to deteriorate or become inert as the rest of the world moves on, and I think that describes a lot of what's happened to a number of countries around the world, then you can actually have a vicious circle in which aggravated inequality drags down the rate of growth, which in turn drags down the level of social participation. And I come from south of the border here. I think that's in fact what we saw in part in my country leading up to the crisis. And this was a thesis underlying the former Indian central bank governor, University of Chicago professor, who wrote a book called Fault Lines. That was it was a thesis of his book, but I digress here. The point is that this is, you got to think of this as a structural policy ecosystem in an economy. And for policy people, what the conclusion of that is that this ecosystem, this represents an alternative way of thinking about structural reform. And it deserves equal emphasis by cabinets and prime ministers and chief economic advisors with the traditional focus of economic policy in countries, which is to say macroeconomic policy or trade and openness. Those are important, no doubt. But this has been underemphasized. This ecosystem has been underemphasized in many countries, both developing and advanced. And that inattention and underemphasis, in my view, is a significant reason why we do have an inequality problem, and we do have populist backlash to openness and technology and the like. So if a country is serious about trying to engage the future, to be open and engage in the world economy, to engage the opportunity of technology, it has to acknowledge forthrightly that a number of these areas have to be dealt with in a very serious fashion and viewed as a system. That's the way forward for a serious response to some of the political polarization and social dispersion that's going on out there. Next slide, please. So here again, we provide a heat map. So for every country that we have data for, somewhat over 100 countries, we provide data, I think about 140 or so indicators across these 15 different areas of policy and institutional strength. And we split them up, the results up into 4 categories of countries by level of income so that they can have a peer comparison. And the purpose of that, all of this really is to provide a basis for a strategy discussion in a country, to see what they can learn from their peers, what they can teach their peers. And use it as a basis for a strategic, hopefully multi-stakeholder discussion in society about how you form a smart growth agenda that actually can command the necessary political support, because every context nationally is different. We don't represent that the numbers here is anywhere near an objective absolute truth. It's a tool, basically. It's a way to have a more evidence-based and strategic conversation that is holistic and therefore potentially more sufficient in response to the seriousness of the problem. Next slide. We put out a global competitiveness report. It's pretty well recognized as the benchmark in the field. And so we took a look, as you would expect, at the numbers, at what the correlation is between what we find on the inclusive growth and development performance side, factors on the one hand and competitiveness on the other. And the headline tells it here. There's, unlike maybe a decade or two ago when people said, well, we got to be careful about addressing social inclusion because it could make us less competitive in the world economy. No, the numbers don't bear that out. The story, in fact, is quite the opposite. Next. Okay, Canada. We're here in Canada, and it's nice to have this conversation in Canada because for a couple of reasons. One is that Canada is a country that does relatively well compared to its peers of advanced countries. It has some weaknesses, and we can talk about that a little bit later in more granular depth if people want to. But by and large, we go to the next slide. We have a heat map for Canada as well. But at any rate, that's the first reason, is Canada has a relatively, it's not perfect, it's not, as good as it could be, and I think the government here would tell you that because that's why they've developed such an important strategy in this area. But it is a more balanced growth model than many of its peers. You'll see Canada there. And then the second thing is that, in fact, the Canadian government is doing, as I interpret it, what we're suggesting internationally, which is to have a serious systemic think about the different possible areas for those synergies, those win-wins between growth and inclusion, those areas where you can deepen institutional strength or improve policy incentives. That would be good for growth and for inclusion. And your country has run through both an internal governmental discussion as well as a multi-stakeholder advisory council process, which I think is an example for the world. And that's part of the reason it's such a pleasure to be here talking about this subject. So there are myriad implications that flow from this. What I think I've just described to you is a different mental map for economic policymakers. It's a different. I think it's a growth model shift, change. There's been a lot of reliance on fiscal stimulus, monetary easing, export-led production, export surpluses for some countries. Those engines of global growth have reached the point of diminishing returns, I think is fairly widely acknowledged. What many parts of the world are trying to do is to shift toward a more sustainable growth model in the sense that it is driven more by internal dynamics of economies and less reliant on short-term demand management, if you will. And I would submit to you, just to close here, that what we've just described is a way to create a new growth engine for the world economy. And we're sitting here in a development institution, and I would say when I say that in a more abstract way, what that also means is that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement, which has huge growth opportunities embedded in it in terms of investment in efficiency-enhancing new energy and transport systems, that's a growth agenda. That's the kind of growth agenda that diffuses benefits at a human level. And I believe that's the flip side of the same coin I'm talking about here when I talk about this structural policy ecosystem. All of that, in my view, is a way to move the world economy and many big economies within it toward a more robust growth model, but also one that is more sustainable and socially inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Samans. Thank you, Joanne, for the introductions. I find this idea, and certainly here at IDRC, a fantastic opportunity to talk about the framework to discuss these growth models. I think the idea that growth and equity are not necessarily exclusive, that there can be win-wins is an absolutely critical framework to discuss. For the great thing about the web report, of course, is that it crosses the global. Crosses the globe. This is relevant for OECD context, is relevant for developing country context. What we will do, so thank you so much for that, for presenting this and for being such a wonderful partner with IDRC. What we'll do next is that we will move into one experience from one of the regions you discussed, on a topic that you discussed, where you did indeed indicate that there doesn't need to be a trade-off between growth and equity, which was social protection. And it's a great pleasure that Carolina Trivelli was already introduced by Joanne, and she will talk about some of the experience in Latin America, particularly from Peru, but it has a broader relevance around social protection and how that indeed can potentially also contribute to growth. So very great pleasure to have you here, Carolina, and the floor is yours. Would you like to sit there?
It's working. Thank you to IDRC for the invitation. My pleasure to be here. I don't know how familiar are you with what has happened in Peru in recent years, but to let you know in a very quick way, in the last 12 years, the poverty rate in Peru came down from 55% to 21 actually this year. The extreme poverty rate from 16 to 4. And the Gini coefficient also came down from 0.5 to 0.44. And the interesting thing is that when you see what's behind those major changes, we pass in 1 decade of being a country where the majority of the population live in poverty to a country run by an emerging middle class, is that the two major forces driving these big changes were different combinations at different moments between economic growth, a rapid economic growth, especially in the early years of last decade, and a combination of social policies that took advantage of that rapid economic growth to really put that economic growth really near the poorer people of the country, and allowing these people living in poverty to take advantage of these newly created opportunities in terms of bringing this economic growth to the places where they live, and with the tools they could really use to take advantage of this. So for me, being a former minister of a social sector, it's like music to my ears to have someone from the World Economic Forum saying, well, these two things go together. In the case of Peru, we know they go together. And in some years, the dominated effect will come from the economic growth. And in some other years, the major effect will come from social policy. But it's in the combination of these two that we could see a long-standing story that translated in new opportunities and new and better outcomes for the Peruvian people. So having an institution like the World Economic Forum saying it brings a completely new setting for these conversations to happen within a government, between the government and the private sector, between the more social interested groups in society with the businessmen. And that really opens a new conversation and brings new partners to that conversation. So I'm really glad that we are having that conversation here, and that we have now this new instrument to really help us to have a better dialogue and a better way of planning and using our economic and social policies for the benefit of all. As you were saying, now we have a wider angle lens to see to see progress. And once we have in this conversation in the same level the GDP and the inequality measurements, then the conversation is really different, and the resources that we have in our hands as policy tools, but also as fiscal resources to achieve all those objectives, translates in a new set of policies. And I think what we don't know yet is how to do that in the real world. We know that that will require a lot of coordination. We know what programs work better, what things help more to reduce inequality or to increase the velocity of growth. But what we need now is to begin learning how to do everything at the same time. What are the best instruments for that? And for that, we need a lot of experimentation, a lot of research, and we need to keep this conversation open to see what is the future development of these indicators that will allow us to measure if we are really doing real progress in all these different aspects for our people. So the way in which we could use this new instrument is it's going to be for sure a global thing, but every country will probably have different uses for this instrument, and I think there's a richness in following up how each country, each economy could begin using this as a policy tool and as a performance indicator for their own decisions.
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to move to questions very, very quickly. There's one thing I'd like to invite, particularly Richard, Carolina, you want to say something about as well, to elaborate a little on, and I'm partly saying that because of the wonderful work that the World Economic Forum has done on gender. In your discussion about inequality, this mostly referred to inequality between households. You did not say a lot about gender. Is this framework useful from a gender perspective? Do you also perceive that there are potential win-wins?
Absolutely. In fact, we have embedded into several of these pillars a gender data set, because you cannot, for the reasons embedded in the premise of your question, one of the biggest unexploited opportunities for an improved inclusive growth model, both growth and inclusion, is in addressing some of the gender gaps. So whether it's in education or the way the workforce is trained and is compensated, to access to basic services. We have a gender look at the data for each one of these. That is part of what drives these scores. So, I mean, that's fundamental. For some countries, particularly East Asian societies, this is probably the biggest piece of low-hanging fruit, if you will, for a more inclusive growth strategy. The Japanese government has identified this as one of the central elements of its so-called third arrow reforms. The Korean government has not placed as much emphasis on this, but there's probably just as much upside of doing so as well. But it's not only East Asian economies. Many economies have some significant work to do in this area.
No, I would just add that having the gender division in all these key performance indicators also allows each of the countries to really begin thinking in improving certain policies that are general for everybody, but then when you add the gender component, could be a lot better. We were discussing in the morning the importance, for example, if also in programs like conditional cash transfers, that are delivered mostly to women, and you say, well, that's already having the gender component. But then when you analyze the results, the female-headed households, for example, have achieved a lot less than a household with both parents living in there. So then you could really, to get the benefits of closing that gender gap, includes also to begin improving those traditional policies also for women, and to learn how to close that gap and to achieve those benefits from them.
Let's move to questions then in the audience. I don't know, I forgot whether we mentioned this or not, but what we're saying is being recorded. We will put that on the website soon, so just that you are aware. For the benefit of the rest of the audience, and us, if you have a question, if you can briefly introduce yourself, say what your name is and who you work for. Who would like to start off with questions? Be quick. I have many more, but I'd like you to get engaged in this, so please.
Hi, my name is Andrew Hurst. I'm with the Think Tank Initiative here at IDRC. I wanted to ask both speakers a fairly obvious question, but it's one I think that bears being asked in this context, and that is a bit about what, from your perspectives, can actually sustain the kind of political agenda that strikes me needs to be behind a broad-based support and commitment to a package of policy reforms and structural reforms that this kind of assessment suggests. We saw in certain countries, obviously, that some have done better than others, and there are reasons for that. I'm just wondering if you could speak to, perhaps in some cases, what those reasons were beyond the sort of policy, because of course politics always precedes policy in many ways, and what the kinds of consequences are for research organizations like ours. We're in a context now when there's very fundamental challenges to evidence. This is very clear evidence, but there doesn't seem to be a great deal of appetite for evidence in many countries around the world, with some very positive exceptions. So then what does that suggest for the kinds of political agendas and that need to sustain and need to be behind pushes for these kinds of things? Thanks.
So we see if there's other questions, particularly if they directly related to this. I'm sure there's lots to say. But anybody wants to comment further on this? Any questions directly related to this? To Richard then, and Carolina, maybe you want to say something?
Well, let's face it, Carolina has more credibility in talking about this than I do, because she's actually been a minister in a government that has pushed through reforms and had to deal with the politics of this. And it's been absolutely remarkable a record, as you just described. So I would defer to you. I'm happy to come in maybe with a thought or two, but I want to defer to you if you'd like to respond.
Okay, thank you. I would say that evidence that is required to make this better decisions in terms of what policies are to be implemented, it's a critical piece. It's not the only one. You need a lot more other things. And one of these other things, it's also relevant to the policy, to the research results you get. And it's, building this common senses among the people deciding, which can be the political leaders or the business community or the of governmental officials. But when you have this new common sense that are backed by sound evidence, it's a lot easier to have these discussions. And if you have good indicators, good data to show that, it's also relevant. I think today we have a lot of evidence of what works, but not on how we make that work. We all know that if we take good social protection programs, sound economic policies, we take them with good infrastructure to a poor place in one country, things will improve there. The question now is how we make that happen, how we put all the incentives to allow all these forces to go and provide all these things in the same place, relevant for the same household, and to have it for enough long period of time to make it work. So those small interactions, those institutional arrangements, those political economy issues are not really well studied. So I think there's a lot of room for that type of research that will complement this sound evidence work based on evaluations, RCTs, and other types of research. So I think there's a big agenda now supported by these indicators, how we do all this together.
Let me add on the really important what we call political economy dynamics of this, or just the politics of it. A couple thoughts. First, as I have found that this is a signal issue in such a wide spectrum of countries, even though their context is different. But this issue about whether people are marginalized and not fully participating in the wealth that's being generated in the economy goes from, the richest countries like the States, or maybe not as much here, but to some extent here as well, right through to middle-income countries like Brazil, Turkey. China the government is running as fast as it can to stay ahead of the employment challenges that they have, trying to shift their growth model all the way through to low-income countries, where there's a great frustration that many people are marginalized from participating in the economy. So that's number one. Many leaders see that they have a big upside if they can crack this problem. That's part one. Part two is technology has absolutely possessed people right now. There is just fear out there, I find, in a lot of the debate about not only the disruption that has occurred thus far, but in what is coming down the track. Automation on both the robot side and the algorithm side increasingly is being understood as something that's gathering pace. It's not plateaued by any stretch of the imagination. This is provoking all sorts of social discussion. And here again, leaders, get back to the politics of this. Leaders, I believe, are searching for a way to talk to their populations about this in a constructive manner. So the second reason there's a political marketplace for this. Third, what we're describing here by taking this out of the context of purely redistribution, or let's just send lots more people to university, helps in a couple of respects. One is that if you look at the framework, I went through it very, very quickly. If I'd had more time, I would have directed your attention to several of those 15 subpillars, which really relate to the business and investment climate in a country. So corruption and what economists call concentration of rents, that is to say, industries that are controlled just by a few companies, or regulatory capture. In other words, big companies basically being able to sort of influence the shape of regulation that suppresses competition on the one hand. The way the financial system generally, not just the banks, but the financial system generally, intermediate your savings into investments in productive assets and capabilities in what we call the real economy, as opposed to exchanges of assets in financial markets or exchanges of already existing real estate. These things really matter. Access to capital more generally is a very, very important element here. So my point is that the framework we've laid out is one in which there is the possibility to get beyond the old polemic about growth versus equity, about business versus labor. Business and labor are interdependent, have a codependency here of a better institutional enabling environment for inclusive growth. And that helps politically. If you can take that message and then you have some businesses who actually come in, and I think that's part of what your point is, if you got some significant business leaders in an economy to be standing there with moral leaders, religious leaders who care very much about the ethical dimensions of inequality, along with social activists, development entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, or anti-poverty advocates, all of them together saying that this is a framework where we see directly what we work on, but we also see that actually what some of the other social actors work on is part of the story. That then creates a better political environment potentially as well. Finally, and this is, I think, the main response to your question, we, as much as we have invested time, thought, energy, blood, sweat, and tears. I have my colleague here, Gemma Corrigan, our economist, who's been working with us on this. A lot of effort's gone into getting this framework right and getting the data. As serious as we take all that, the reality is we view it as a mere entry point for hopefully a strategic discussion in a country. And we prefer that to be multi-stakeholder, because if you have the private sector, social actors, and the government at the table talking about the strategy generally, then you get a degree of buy-in socially that improves the politics as well for reform. And so we like to think of this as, this whole program is not the end of it. The whole end result of it is not the report. The report is just sort of a stepping stone for us to try to help ministers like Carolina have a cross-ministry public-private conversation in their countries about this. And that's when you crack through the politics, it seems to me.
I believe the next question was from the left. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Martín Vidal. I'm the ambassador of Uruguay to Canada. I would like first to congratulate and thank the IDRC for inviting us to this very good conversation, very enlightening. I think it's very refreshing, and as the minister Carolina mentioned at the beginning, it's very good to learn that the WEF is taking this so seriously so far. It would be very good that this kind of discussion, we have it in our region. I pay a lot of attention to the first question that was asked, because this issue is so connected to very strong and very drastic political transitions, different transitions in the last 15 years in Latin America, that to have, in my opinion, an overall very detailed with facts and indicators discussion will bring a lot of sense to many of the political discussions in different countries of our region. But I have two questions, one for Carolina, one for Richard. The first one to Carolina, considering how well Peru has performed in the last decade. We as Uruguay also have very good indicators to show, but we are focusing in Peru right now. So this is, I think, a shared worry that maybe we can both have together, maybe Marcelo from Argentina as well. It's regarding the sustainability of the gains. We are, this is nothing that I'm breaking any confident matter, but we are afraid about the middle income trap, as was called some time ago. We have achieved with Chile and Antigua from Latin America the level of high-income country this year by OECD, but we are not so sure that we can sustain the gains if we don't keep performing well in the next 10, 15 years. And we couldn't agree more about the connection between keeping the pie bigger and to continue with the redistribution and the social inclusion. So I would like to ask Carolina if she shares that for Peru's case, what she sees, what you see, Carolina, that should be the main structural thing that Peru has to address in order to keep the sustainable growth and inclusive growth that can be something that take into account, our country is taking into account. And to Richard, this is an angle that probably the Canadians would like to hear as well, is what has been the thoughts that WEF has been given to the role of free trade in inclusive growth, now that from many platforms from political spectrum in different countries has been perceived or seen as an instrument that not necessarily promotes inclusive growth. And some decades ago, when a lot of free trade agreements started to happen, and it was clearly a consensus about the benefit for growth from free trade. So if there is any new thinking about that or reaction adapted to the current times. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I completely agree with you that we are all facing in Latin America this major worries about how to overcome the middle income trap for all our countries. Mostly in the cases of countries like Peru, which depend so significantly in commodity prices. So I think the good lesson for us is that in these last 3 years, with very low commodity prices, we did well. Not as well as we were doing with good commodity prices, for sure, but we did well. And that's why this combination between the relevance of economic policy and social policies changes a lot, because the external conditions change a lot. The main challenge for us today, in the case of Peru, is institutional change, because we need an institutional reform to really create sound institutions that will allow us to have these new types of combined economic and social policies sustainable, and not only based on the political will of one group or the group which is in power. We need to ensure that that becomes the institutional setting of the country. And that means a lot of different things. Economic institutions for sure, but also political institutions. Different from Uruguay, we have a country with almost non-political parties. So the group that wins an election has a party that was created 3 years before. So that's completely unsustainable, because you cannot have a dialogue with people sitting in the table that changes every 5 years for all. So I would stay with institutional reforms as my first choice for our major task in the future.
On middle income trap, which is a tough question and one that requires a lot of time, so we don't have that here. But I think there is, and here again, Canada is at the forefront of trying to think through what constitutes a more inclusive international trade and investment agenda. I give them a lot of credit for trying to tackle that in the ministry here, Minister Freeland, head on. There are a few elements. We do treat in the report. We have a series of policy recommendations for both domestic policy and for international economic cooperation. And there is a segment on trade and investment. Just a couple of elements of it. SMEs and enabled by digital. It's a new world now, because one of the benefits of technology, yes, there are a lot of disruptions, but there's a big upside potential for developing economies, in the sense that you don't need a huge corporate presence on the ground to sell a product and to market it. So the contact with markets, new customers around the world, is absolutely, the opportunities there are very large. And this is it's not well documented, but it's a very rapidly growing share of the exports of developing countries is internet-enabled commerce, number one. So, but many economies are not set up yet policy-wise to enable that. They have some strange rules that discriminate against this type. So this is an agenda for trade policy internationally as well as domestically, number one. And I'm happy to say that the Forum and ECLAC are working together now on at their request, on a Latin America e-commerce, a common set of policy initiatives that could improve the integration within the Latin America region of internet-enabled commerce. One, investment is another. We've had a regime on investment that's been overtaken a little bit by events in the economy and in political economy. And by that, I just basically mean that there are ways to facilitate investment in parts of the developing world that have not received it well yet. Most international value chain investment is concentrated in a dozen countries or so. So there are things that can be done by the international community that would broaden country participation in the way commerce is now organized globally. And then secondly, in having a new model of better balance between the investor and the corporate responsibilities in investment, and making the patchwork quilt of about 3,200 investment agreements around the world, cleaning that up a bit so that it's easier for companies to operate across jurisdictions. That hurts most the smaller firms. The big firms have the legal departments to handle that. But so I'm not going to go on here, but there are several elements of an agenda that will help economies move from reliance on commodities on the one hand to their domestic market on the one hand, which is a lot of what this agenda is about, but also to seize opportunities internationally that are relatively new in this regard.
Neil Bradford. I teach public policy at Western University, and I think it's a fascinating presentation and really very important work. But I have a kind of broader question, maybe slightly academic, which might be appropriate here. But I think that all of this needs to be somehow grounded in an alternative theory or logic of collective action. That what you really are proposing here are a series of kind of new boundary-crossing relationships between the economic, the social, the environmental. Between business, government, civil society, between levels of government, short and long-term thinking. And right now, we do not have a theory of sort of social behavior that really underpins the kinds of institutional relationships that Carolina is really pointing at, but in turn are necessary to really advance this World Economic Forum agenda. I mean, I don't have the answer to this, but we need to think more about at a really quite profound level, how we realize our own self-interest through longer-term participation in a series of networked social relations. And I think we need to think about collaboration at that very kind of fundamental level to be able to drive forward this multiple kind of set of relationships that all turn on something more than just short-term self-interest, and require that a whole variety of sectors begin to rethink how they relate to one another and how their short-term gains are in fact leveraged and manifested through a variety of social partnerships. And until we get a kind of conventional wisdom about that logic of collective action, we're struggling. We're struggling with the institutions, with the incentives, with the policies, with the politics. We need a new theory of collective action here to underpin all of this in a robust way. It's a big 21st century challenge. I mean, it's what Maynard Keynes came up with in the 1930s. It was a multi-level rethinking of behavior, institutions, and policy, and we don't yet have that package.
Before you're going to resolve that in 30 seconds at the end of this, I think there's one more comment at the end. I think we're running out of time, so this will be the last comment perhaps. Thank you, Neil.
I'd like to second this, and I would also like to add that this will also require different kinds of economic analysis, econometric analysis, and it will need a skills upgrade. There are some methods out there right now with that will allow us to analyze multiple goals, which is one of the issues that I think we've had. We were only able to model one goal at a time, and also to model different paths to the same outcome. Those methods are starting to arise, but they need to be put into that theory. So I'd really like to hear your answer.
Just to make it simpler, I suppose. Thank you for that. It's very, very
I think we've just gotten the terms of reference for a new political philosophy. Basically, that's what you're calling for. And you're right. I mean, just an anecdote. When we were in Davos in January, we released this. We talked to the media and whatever. We had a Brazilian reporter, Gemma, if you recall this, who came up and said, you don't have to explain it to me. I've read it. I get it. You're suggesting a paradigm change. But how are you going to communicate this? And we looked at each other with blank stares. We hadn't thought yet about exactly the point you're making, which is, how do you begin to engage people in a way that changes not just their mental map about economic policy, which is what we're talking about here, but a larger question about their mental map of governance, if you will. So if you're up to the task of helping us take the TORs and turn that into a political philosophy, I think everybody here would be customers. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I think it was a great question to the two last comments to end the conversation with. For me, it illustrates the purpose of this conversation, if you like, for IDRC, which is a research organization, what the research agenda should move towards. And I think in what IDRC has done, and the partnership, particularly with the World Economic Forum, is part of that, is to engage with people outside that traditional justice agenda to see how you can promote those values. In the Canadian context, this has been quite, for me, being very revealing, because within the private sector, there are people that want to do that. There are people that, and they look at some of the new business models that say, we have our Canadian democratic justice values, and we want to bring that into our business practices, right? That's something as a research organization we had never thought of, and I think that's what you're illustrating as well. We've seen, and even in the conversation this morning, there's a government agenda to do that, and even then it's like, and how do we bring the private sector in, right? Whereas we're all private sector, participants, if you like, right? So certainly for a research agenda, I think, yes, it is a theoretical question. There's nothing more practical than a good theory, but it's what my previous mentors have taught me. So I think it is a wonderful thing to end with, and I think it illustrates very much why we're having this conversation. So I want to thank everybody for coming, for spending your time at IDRC. I want to thank our visitors from far away, Carolina, Richard, Gemma, Terry, come across to Canada to share this with us. We hope to continue. We will continue the partnerships for sure. We hope to continue the conversation and hope to see you again here soon. Thank you so much. Thank you.